First off, I'd just like to thank everyone for joining our monthly webinar series. My name is Brett Sheffers. For those of you who haven't met me, I'm an associate professor at University of Florida, and I'm helping coordinate efforts in forming the Southeast Risk Management Network, along with Wes Daniels at USGS, Wes Daniel and Dia Laurence at University of Florida. I thought I'd just take a minute to chat a bit about the slide that's up on your screen regarding the Southeast Risk Management Network, in case of some of you are new to the webinar series. And so the Southeast Risk is a regional node of an overall national, it's a national network across North America. It was originally started in the Northeast and now has kind of spread regionally. And each node carries relatively similar aims and scopes. It's generally to reduce the joint effects of climate change, invasive species. And we hope to achieve this by a few objectives. We're a network that aims to kind of summarize and kind of communicate science behind climate change, invasive species, identify needs of managers, but also share knowledge of managers and how to address these issues. We hope to build kind of strong scientist manager communities, and also kind of guide as well as conduct priority research. Again, we're relatively new. We just launched over the summer of this year, and we have some initiatives current and in the future to kind of build momentum behind the network. And one of those is this webinar series. It's the third Thursday of every month, and so we have Dave Coyle at Clemson University who will be speaking in November. In December, we have we took off for the holidays, and then we'll resume the webinar series January 19th in the new year with Mike Osland of USGS. We also have a workshop planned in the new year. More information will be sent about that workshop, but it's a science integration management workshop, as well as kind of formulating and continue to form the network. And for those of you that haven't joined our listserv, in the corner, you'll see a QR code. Go ahead and scan that, and you can join the listserv, where we'll be sending out information about the webinars, research summaries that highlight work on invasive species and climate change in the region, as well as other communications. So if you have any questions, please kind of direct them to me, or actually I should have put my email up there. Search my name, Brett Sheffers, and reach out to me. I'm happy to get back to you. But enough with the network. Today we're here to hear from Stas Burgiel. He serves as the executive director. So let me switch my, oh my goodness. Well, sorry, I'm having an issue with my slides here. So sorry. So Stas is the executive director at National Invasive Species Council, NISC. He's worked and consulted for a range of non-governmental, governmental, intergovernmental organizations. That includes the Global Invasive Species Program, Nature Conservancy, UNEP and World Conservation Monitoring Center, and the International Institute for Sustainable Development. He's received his BA from Swarthmore College, PhD in International Service from American University. Stas, thank you so much for taking the time to join us today for the webinar. I will go ahead and turn it over to you so you can update us on NISC. So let me stop sharing here. I guess I'll have to exit, sorry.
Okay, let me pull this up.
Yeah.
And hopefully that works successfully. Well, I'd like to start by thanking Brett, Wes, and Dia for extending an invitation to talk to the Southeast RISCC. I'm particularly enjoyed by this opportunity because I'm certainly familiar with some of the climate change invasive species dynamics in the West and the Northeast, and I think it'll be great to get more of a sense over time as you guys sort of continue with your work in terms of the dynamics in the Southeast. As Brett mentioned, I'm with the National Invasive Species Council, which is a federal level interagency body. And what I'm going to do today is talk from the federal perspective. And so this is mostly the work that the council is doing. It is certainly tied into the work of other federal agencies, and we work a lot with personnel and staff from a range of federal agencies, and I'll talk about that as we go through the presentation. Basically, I plan to spend maybe 35 to 40 minutes. We'll first and foremost go through the background and kind of history of the council so you understand what we are and how we operate. Then I'll get into the meat, the work plan activities, our substantive activities, and then I'll finish up with a couple points on opportunities for engagement, thinking about moving forward. The one kind of caveat that I did want to give at the start is the way that our work plans are divided out. We have a specific thematic issue, which is on climate change itself, but then we have a number of other separate thematic issues. I'm going to go through those. We can look at some of those other issues like wildland fire through the lens of climate, but within this presentation, there are some issues that are going to be sort of explicit in terms of the climate connection, and then some of the others are a little bit more implicit. But I thought it'd be useful just to go over the range of activities that we're engaged in. So starting with the background, the council was established by executive order under the Clinton administration in 1999. And then there was a second executive order in 2016 at the end of the Obama administration that kind of refreshed the council and the issues that we're focused on. That first executive order was largely centered around awareness raising of invasive species issues, both within and across federal agencies, as well as with the broader public and other non-federal partners. The 2016 executive order shifted that to have more of an operational focus. So what are some of the key issues that we need to be thinking about and addressing in the process of invasive species management? So moving beyond a lot of the awareness that has grown sort of since 1999 and really focusing on the management part of things. The council itself is composed of the secretaries or administrators of 12 federal departments and 4 White House offices, and I'll go into those more specifically in the next slide. Our efforts and day-to-day work is and has been guided by management plans and annual work plans. You'll notice for the management plans, those were initially supposed to be 3 years in duration, but many of them, including the first 2, had upwards of 80 or 90 activities, which were very kind of hard to track, to maintain accountability. And so in 2020, we switched over to an annual work plan process. And in so doing, those early plans included work by the council itself, so where there was interagency cooperation, but also activities that the individual agencies were doing themselves. In the switch to the work plans, we're really just focusing on work that the council is doing through interagency task teams and the like. And so we've gone from, I think, sort of 94 outputs in the very first 2001 management plan to now about sort of 5 broad themes with maybe 7 to 8 outputs. So it's much more manageable, and we can be a little bit more responsive as new issues emerge. We also work at both a kind of a high level political level as well as at the program level. The council and its activities are facilitated by a small staff. So I'm the director of that staff. I've got 3 folks who work with me in terms of helping with the coordination, the communications, and the like. And then finally, we're advised by a FACA committee, a federal advisory committee called the Invasive Species Advisory Committee, or ISAC. And broadly, I've included the mission statement for NISC in the bottom of the page, but really it's providing that national level leadership and vision in terms of invasive species and how to address them and their impacts. So this provides an overview of the different agencies and offices that are part of the council. The co-chairs come from the departments of Agriculture, Interior, and Commerce. And for Commerce, that's specifically NOAA, the National Oceanographic and Atmospheric Administration. But then we have broader participation from Defense, Homeland Security, which includes both Customs and Border Protection, as well as Coast Guard, Transportation, EPA, Health and Human Services, NASA. From the international side, we have U.S. Agency for International Development and the State Department. And one of the things that happened with the 2016 executive order is it brought on 3 new White House offices, and those were Council on Environmental Quality, Office of Management and Budget, and the Office of Science and Technology Policy. And the nice thing about the addition of those 3 offices is that it really helps tie together the work of the different departments with the priorities that are coming out of the White House and the administration. I mentioned that we work at sort of 2 different levels. At a leadership level, the secretaries and administrators, while nominally composing the council, delegate their roles to other senior officials. So in many cases, we have political appointees, or in some cases, senior civil servants who are our high-level political representatives. It depends on the structure of the department itself. And they provide sort of the final sign-off on documents that make the higher level decisions. And then on a day-to-day basis, we work with senior advisors from each of the departments who basically facilitate communications across their departments, across the programs within those departments with the work of NISC. Then there's the NISC staff, which helps facilitate all of this, as well as the advisory council or the advisory committee, which provides advice to the council. I mentioned the work plans that we've been working off of for the past couple of years. I'll go into the issues in more depth in the coming slides, but I just wanted to note and differentiate between some of the core coordination activities that we play, and that's just the day-to-day holding meetings, updates, responding to member agency requests, compiling information around spending through a cross-cut budget, and then kind of the thematic activities that we work on, like climate change or wildland fire. So I'm going to use that as the segue into talking a little bit more about the substantive work that we do. And I just showed this slide, but really I'm going to sort of dive into the issues that are in that bottom tier under the thematic priority activities, starting with climate change. And in the area of climate change, our kind of initial hooks or foray into the issue kind of started back in sort of 2014, 2015. At that time, NISC partnered with the Aquatic Nuisance Species Task Force, another interagency committee that's obviously focused on aquatic invasive species, putting together what was basically a summary document collating where we were seeing intersections between invasive species and climate change. And part of that was also to help improve communication across the invasive species community and the climate change community. And that kind of bridging across silos is a theme that I'll come back to again at other points in this presentation. Then in 2014, there was also a council that was established by the White House focused on climate preparedness. And one of their recommendations was specifically to set up a national framework for an early detection and rapid response framework. And that was specifically through the lens of climate change in terms of thinking about new species that might be introduced or spread in terms of range shifts, or if there are changes with regards to pathways and pathway dynamics that might bring in new species. They saw the need for a functioning early detection rapid response framework to help address some of those. And then final hook, probably the biggest hook for us, was in that executive order from 2016. One of the emerging priorities that was pulled out in that was specifically the connection between climate change and invasive species. Now, sort of fast forward to today, it wasn't until 2022 that we actually had climate change explicitly written into one of our work plans. There's a number of sort of political and other reasons for that, but it's taken us sort of a while to get, sort of back and truly engaged on the issue. And I should note that in those intervening years, a lot of other work has happened. Obviously, the network of regional networks such as yours has come into play, and I think a lot of those efforts has kind of filled the gap that national level sort of guidance and leadership on the issue might otherwise have played. So in a sense, we're coming back into this game, doing a little bit of catch up, and specifically trying to think through where is the value added that the council and international and interagency coordination can be of benefit. So one of the first things that we've done is to set up a federal community of practice amongst federal practitioners, managers, and the like, with kind of three things. One, just to simply share information on a range of topics. Second, to support individual agency efforts that might already be underway. And third, to identify joint strategic opportunities related to invasive species and climate change that the council might take up. This group has been meeting for several months now. We've had a number of substantive discussions, including in the area of managed relocation or assisted migration, where you have the deliberate translocation of a species that might be endangered or threatened, including through climate change factors. But moving it to a new habitat might present invasive species risk either by that species itself or maybe pests, pathogens, diseases that are associated with that species. So how do we understand and assess and potentially mitigate those risks? We've also looked at range shifts, both in terms of expansion of natives beyond their traditional habitats as well as non-natives. And then most recently had a discussion on use of the RAD framework, the Resist, Accept, Direct framework, decision framework, and how that can apply to invasive species management. Looking forward, we anticipate sessions and discussions around connections between wildlife health and invasive species and climate change, as well as plant and human health. And then another thing that underpins all this is, from an institutional perspective, how does this work inform or intersect with what agencies are developing within their own climate adaptation plans? So within kind of the more formal programs that are have active work on the ground in terms of climate change adaptation, mitigation, and the like, how is the substantive work that we're doing, how is that possible to fit in and integrate with those efforts? Another more specific area that we're working under the climate change umbrella is with regards to disaster preparedness and response. And this is in recognition that natural disasters and extreme weather events have the potential to introduce or spread invasive species. And that can be with the event itself, but it also potentially be in the response in terms of the movement of vehicles, personnel, gear, debris, et cetera. And I anticipate with Hurricane Ian and the recent devastation that it's caused, again, some of these considerations will be coming into play. But within this, the real question, and I talked a little bit before in terms of how do we bridge communities, we've got the invasive species community, which is familiar with many of these species and their risks, but then we also have the disaster or emergency response community. And so within Department of Homeland Security, that's FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Agency. Also, departments have their own offices of emergency management, and they're really trained in that disaster response. So whether it's a wildfire, flooding, hurricane, or the like, that's kind of their bailiwick in terms of how do we do emergency response. And so the key thing that we're trying to do here is try to figure out what kind of information can we be providing to these emergency responders and in what format so that it can be taken up as they are doing other things clearly related to maintaining public health, infrastructure, and the like. And then the final thing I wanted to mention with regards to climate change is within this, there's, I see a lot of need for engagement. First and foremost has been discussions that we have been having, and I hope continue to happen with the different risk networks. I think they have all, to one degree or another, been active in surveying for management and research priorities. And I think a collation of that information will be very helpful for us in terms of understanding priorities across the country. Also, we're working to collaborate on a conference workshop that will be held at the upcoming NASMA conference in Orlando at the beginning of next month. And I think those will be useful inputs for our purposes. Also, I mentioned the Invasive Species Advisory Committee in the past. They have done some work on climate change related issues, including in the marine environment. And I anticipate moving forward that they'll have input into our work plan priorities around climate change. And then finally, I think there's the opportunity to dig into some additional resources, particularly at the federal level. USGS has its climate adaptation centers. Many of those are already linked to the different risk networks. So there's a good nexus with some of the federal folks there. But also USDA has a network of climate hubs, and NOAA has its regional integrated sciences and assessments program. So it's how can we build on and to develop synergies across these different networks. So that's the work around climate change. I'm gonna now talk a little bit about wildland fire, which is another major issue for us. And our efforts there are primarily in terms of thinking about how do we advance landscape scale conservation, particularly through coordinating discussions across the invasive species and wildland fire management community. So again, how do we break down those silos? There are clear connections to climate change here in terms of thinking about the role of warmer winters, longer growing seasons, increased drought, increased CO2 concentrations, species range shifts, in terms, from a climate change perspective, in terms of what that means for fuels that are on the landscape. And that can be the timing of wildland fires, it could be this particular species and their characteristics in terms of flammability and the like. It can be the continuity of species and fuel across the landscape, as well as the sheer amount of biomass that's available for burning. And a major area of attention for this has been, for example, with invasive annual grasses. And with that, there is a lot of focus, particularly in the West, looking at sort of cheatgrass in the Great Basin. But this issue it's a national level issue. We see it in the Northwest, we see it in the Southwest with bufflegrass and red brome. It's an issue in the Southeast with the Kogan grass and old world climbing fern. So our perspective is really sort of having a national discussion, but then figuring out how do we sort of feed that in and leverage work that's going on within the individual regions, recognizing that there's going to be differences in terms of species as well as geographies and ecologies. So what are we doing here from a concrete perspective? That is largely working through a partnership with the Wildland Fire Leadership Council, which we established back in 2020. WFLC, the Wildland Fire Leadership Council, is kind of an analog to NISC in the wildland fire arena, but it also has the benefit of not just including federal agencies, but also state, local, tribal agencies and representation as well. So they have that nice continuity from local government up to federal level government. And we developed this partnership for three main reasons. One, first, to just identify sort of goals and opportunities where we can do a better job of coordination. Two, levering actions across the federal community, or across the federal government, between the invasive species and climate change and wildland fire communities. And then finally, building better engagement with non-federal partners. So this priority has been integrated into our respective strategic plans, and we have an interagency task team that's working on that, including representation from Department of Defense, Interior, Agriculture, as well as Commerce and NOAA. And so that interagency task team that I mentioned has really been focused on identifying the suite of priorities or opportunities where we can advance work. And we went from probably a longer list of 30 to 40 priorities, and then did a review through agencies to identify what are the top ones that might be ripe for interagency collaboration. And we ultimately came up with a list of about 13. And we've divided those across a series of themes. Some of those themes kind of relate to kind of the sequence and chronology of fires themselves. So there's proactive and pre-fire management, so thinking about fuels management on the landscape. There's the response to a wildfire itself. So that's where you get the movement of vehicles and individuals and the potential spread of invasive species. And then post-fire recovery and restoration. So trying to address sort of the regrowth of invasive species in degraded areas. But along with those sequential steps is a recognition that there are some cross-cutting items like funding, information data and management tools, as well as research and development, which informs all of those different stages. And these have been, so I mentioned we've identified 13 opportunities. And right now we've been working with the co-chairs for both NISC and WIFLC to provide a memo to agency leadership, kind of outlining these as well as some steps for moving forward in terms of integrating those into agency actions and programs. And that for us is going to basically take on sort of 3 primary next steps for the NISC WIFLC task team. One is identifying regional and spatial priorities. So where do we actually need to be focusing this work at a landscape level and within the agency's different regional priorities? Second, once those have been identified, how do we establish better communication and coordination across the work that we've been doing at the national level with what's going on at the regional level? And basically, how do we leverage those activities? And then finally, what are the actions that we can take to have applied scientific research and information exchange to support this kind of work as well? And in that sense, we've been very active with the Joint Fire Science Program, which has a research request for proposals process related to wildland fire, as well as the development of a state of the science review on invasive species wildland fires across the ecoregions of the US. So that's wildland fire. Another area, and this goes back to the White House Council on Climate Preparedness that I mentioned. Over the past several years, we've been very focused on early detection and rapid response, and particularly thinking about the conceptual framework for a national EDRR system. And in that regard, NISC has specifically been interested in thinking about federal roles and authorities, the tools for monitoring and response, as well as coordination with other federal agencies and interagency committees. And I should note that kind of we see the value added we provide really at that, in the intersection between federal agencies. We recognize that the interface with states and other non-federal partners is important, but we're also recognizing there are other institutions that can be better suited for that kind of work. For example, the Aquatic Nuisance Species Task Force has 6 regional panels which bring in state representation, academics, and the like, and that's can be a much better interface in terms of working with non-federal partners than some of the actions that we can take would be. So the initial work that we did around the early detection rapid response framework could basically be summed up in a special issue of Biological Invasions, which included 12 articles where we were looking at the federal capacities across a number of specific issues. So think about information and data, watch lists, risk screening, legal authorities, technology innovation, and the like, and figuring out how do we put these capacities within the context of an overall blueprint or framework. And in that effort, one of the things that we recognized is that it had a bias towards the early detection side of things. So that was produced around 2020. What we've been doing since then is really putting a little bit of additional focus on the rapid response side of the equation. And we've got sort of 2 products in play there. The first is looking at federal agency roles for rapid response. And when we break it down, we can really see 3 major buckets where federal agencies are involved in rapid response action. So there's first where they might be a primary lead given their authority. So if it's a new agricultural pest coming into the country, that would fall to USDA and its Animal Plant Health Inspection Service. However, if it's a new introduction to a national park, to a Bureau of Reclamation hydroelectric facility or a national park, then it's those federal agencies that have responsibility for managing lands and waters which are on point for response. And then finally, there may be a situation where it's the state or another entity, a non-federal entity, that is the lead in the rapid response, and federal agencies are providing a partnering or supporting role. They might be providing finances, personnel, equipment, vehicles, boats, and the like, technical information. So looking at these different buckets, what we're trying to do with this report is really, by looking at individual agency authorities, specify what they can or they cannot do. And this report has been cleared by all the agencies and right now is going through a design and layout process before we release it to the public. The second product that I mentioned that focuses on rapid response is looking at the criteria and considerations for a rapid response fund. So when we started this effort, there were no sort of federal requests or budgets allocated to a invasive species rapid response fund, but we've seen recommendations for that at the national level, the regional level, the state level. So we thought it would be a useful exercise to go through and think about what are the key criteria and considerations that we need to go into establishing a fund. So thinking about where the funds are sourced from, how they're administered, scope, eligibility, and the like. And this report was finished earlier this year. It's up online. And I'm happy to say that right now there is some follow-up on it in terms of a budget request from DOI and the Department of the Interior, as well as some work under the Aquatic Nuisance Species Task Force to look at what a pilot fund might look like with regards to aquatic invasive species. So I'm hopeful that that funding comes to pass, and it's kind of nice to see the conceptual work that we've done translating into sort of a more active establishment of that kind of an entity. And then the final area that we've been active in with regards to early detection, rapid response, really stems from about a year and a half, 2 years ago. There was the issue with aquarium moss balls, which are actually algae that were found to be contaminated with zebra mussels. And those were found in pet stores throughout the US. I think it was in 47 states. But there was also the issue of they were basically imported from other countries from Eastern Europe. And so there was this import issue. And what we've been doing is working with 3 of the agencies, responsible agencies at the borders, specifically Customs and Border Protection, which is on point in terms of the reception of commodities and conveyances, with USDA APHIS, which is responsible for monitoring plant health inspection certificates for all imported plants. And then finally with Fish and Wildlife Service, which has the regulatory authority over zebra mussels. So there's this kind of complicated interplay between those 3 different agencies at the border. And really what we're trying to do is make sure that the communications and the protocols are clear such that if something like this were to happen again, it's much easier to sort of act and bring in the requisite actors and individuals at any specific port rather than trying to do catch up, which is some of what we were doing in the initial days of the detection of the zebra mussels and the moss balls. Now I'm quickly going to turn to a couple of other areas. Information management. Invasive species data and information is critical for decision makers in terms of making the management choices that they have to make. And I think what we're trying to do within our work plan is to recognize the importance of those programs, particularly within the federal government. One of those is the National Invasive Species Information Center, which we're looking at as a potential gateway to information on federal programs and priorities related to invasive species, and thinking about what content should be on the site, the structure, as well as its overall long-term sustainability. We're also working on a white paper related to federal information and data programs. So really highlighting things like the non-Indigenous aquatic species database and the like, which are important sources or repositories of information. And in the past, we've seen issues or risks with regards to budget cuts and other cuts to those programs. And I think the goal of this paper is really to highlight the importance of data and those federal programs to decision makers so they can understand that there is reliance among federal agencies in terms of using that data, but also with our non-federal partners. So really, it's just emphasizing the critical need for those. And then one other piece under information management relates back to forecasting and horizon scanning. And again, there's a connection to climate change here in terms of thinking about, well, how do climate-related factors basically impact sort of species and their movement in terms of range shifts? How does it impact pathways and the introduction of new species, or kind of the timing and the variability of how they might be introduced? And so there are a range of federal agencies that have tools related to forecasting and horizon scanning. And what we're trying to do is, one, identify those different tools and programs along with the various data that they collect. And then two, try to make sure that as best we can, how can we share that data and make sure that it's available to those who need it, whether it's within the federal government or for non-federal partners. We do recognize that within this, there are some areas where there's sort of proprietary information or there might be confidential information with regards to trade data. But again, we're just trying to make sure that we have a full sense of the range of activity that's going on with regards to horizon scanning and forecasting for invasive species threats, whether that's to public health, to the environment, to agriculture, and the like. Environmental DNA has been another area where we've been active, and over the past 2 years, we've put out sort of 2 products. One has been a technical paper really outlining the considerations that invasive species managers might want to consider if they are looking at bringing environmental DNA for detection purposes into their programs. And then we use that to distill a NISC white paper that focuses on that specifically from the optics of federal agencies. So what are the concerns of federal agencies moving forward with regards to the use of eDNA? At the beginning, I mentioned as one of our core coordination activities that we undertake a cross-cut budget, and that's basically collating information from agencies on their spending around invasive species. And we do that across 7 different categories, which on this slide are represented by the different colors. So the light blue is prevention, the orange is early detection, rapid response, the yellow is research. And this way we can identify trends in spending over time. And it's astonishing to me in terms of looking at from over the course of the last 10 years, moving from about a little over $2 billion in expenditures up to almost in FY21, almost $4 billion. The other interesting sort of take home that I have from this slide is with COVID, I had suspected that funding in FY21 and 22 would actually have declined because a major source, almost $1 billion, comes through the Customs and Border Protection, which assesses user fees for the inspection of commodities, conveyances, as well as international travelers. And with COVID, we saw a decline in traveling. We also saw a decline in terms of the import of goods. And I thought that that might sort of reflect a concurrent decline with regards to overall federal expenditures. But in fact, in that area, it seems to have been fairly constant. And we actually saw an increase on the research side, which I think is largely due to funding that came through the American Recovery Plan Act to USDA, as well as some to Department of Interior for surveillance of zoonotic diseases. So it's interesting to see, some of the consequences of how the COVID scenario has impacted budgets. And then finally, I just want to sort of close out the discussion on work plan activities that for fiscal year 23, we're looking forward in terms of other potential activities, including those that align with administration priorities. So, as one possible example under outreach and engagement, a major focus of the Biden administration has been environmental justice and underserved communities. But thinking through how does that intersect with invasive species and how can we look at that from an interagency perspective isn't exactly clear. So, maybe doing some more work in terms of identifying what are the specific actions that can be taken in that regard, whether it's looking at human health issues, livelihood, and the like. So that could be one area. Also, whereas with most of the other thematic areas I described, there were concrete outputs. There are areas where it might be useful for NISC just to engage in interagency dialogue without producing a concrete paper in and of itself. One of these areas could be public health. So the Department of Health and Human Services has been working on a vector-borne disease strategy, as well as a One Health framework. And so one of the things that we can do with our agencies is make sure that those discussions are including the invasive species components or facets of those issues. And so with just sort of the final couple minutes, I did want to talk a little bit about opportunities for engagement. At the beginning, I mentioned our FACA committee, ISAC, the Invasive Species Advisory Committee. Some of you may know that under the last administration, it was sort of allowed to sunset. And with the incoming administration, there was a clear signal that they wanted to reestablish or reconstitute ISAC and get it up and running again. However, that process isn't, it doesn't turn on a dime. It takes a little bit of work. It requires an executive order that authorizes the renewal. That has gone through. We've also had our charter developed and signed for approval. And then the most recent step has been actually populating the advisory committee itself. And there are sort of, it's termed, the class members have various terms. We have gone out and done a process to request nominations. We've developed a slate and proposed those up through the Department of Interior's White House liaison, but they do have to be vetted through the White House. And now the unfortunate thing is that we're not the only advisory committee that has been in this process of reestablishment or renewal. So there's a little bit of a backlog in terms of reviewing the various slates of candidates, but we're optimistic that we can have a meeting of ISAC hopefully sometime this fall or winter. One of the big differences with regards to the upcoming ISAC compared to the past ISAC, in the past 20 years of ISAC, is that we will have ex officio members who are have standing representation on the committee. And those include representatives from Association of Fish and Wildlife agencies, conservation districts, Native American Fish and Wildlife Society, State Department of Agriculture, NASMA, as well as the Plant Board. And I think having that sort of consistent expertise from organizations that also do this as part of their daily bread and butter will be very helpful for ISAC. Now, one of the questions might be like, well, how does that sort of intersect with folks on the phone? Because we've already done sort of the call for nominees. The way that ISAC works is we identify sort of priority activities and then form subcommittees to go off and do kind of the hard work, the detailed work. And within those subcommittees, we can bring in other experts who are not ISAC members. And we recognize ISAC's probably going to have a total of 18 folks. So it can't have every knowledge on every single invasive species issue, geography, or the like. And so really, we rely on the broader invasive species community to come in and join those subcommittees to provide us with the additional context and information that can inform the advice that ultimately goes to the council. And just as an example, these are some of the areas in the white papers that ISAC has generated in the past. Climate change is on there, including looking at marine bioinvasions, but also issues like e-commerce, harvest incentives, managed relocation, wildlife health issues, as well as institutional issues like how do we improve federal tribal coordination or federal state coordination. And I anticipate moving forward that this list will continue to grow as we get additional input from ISAC. And then the final slide I have is thinking about funding, because funding is often a key question that we get. We've been very fortunate recently with regards to an influx of funding that can potentially go to invasive species. So with the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law or the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, there was an influx of funding for invasive species. So under the restoration title of that bill, there's funding specifically going to the Department of Interior, as well as the Forest Service. I think they each get $100 million over the course of 5 years for invasive species work. Also, NOAA is receiving several $100 million focused on habitat restoration. And while that's not specifically or explicitly tied to invasive species, they are considering invasive species related issues within their request for proposals for habitat restoration. The bill also includes funding in other areas, wildland fire being sort of a major component there, and funds are going to Interior as well as Forest Service for fuels management, which could link up to invasive plants, invasive annual grasses, and the like. And then finally, some of this money is also associated with the America the Beautiful Challenge, which the Council on Environmental Quality is running, and it's basically set up as sort of a larger one-stop shop for submitting proposals related to conservation priorities. So if you haven't seen that, please check it out. It's being run through the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation. Also recently, we've seen the passage of the Inflation Reduction Act. which includes funds going towards climate change, adaptation, resilience, and mitigation. It's still early days in terms of knowing whether any of those funds can sort of flow down or be associated with invasive species and how they interact with climate change. And so we'll be looking at that to see whether there are opportunities. And then finally, I've posted sort of 2 resources. One, the National Invasive Species Information Center, which I mentioned before, has a page devoted to grant and funding opportunities. And then also the Department of the Interior recently put out a funding guide that documents the various funding opportunities that the DOI bureaus offer. So you could check those out as well. And so with that, I want to say thank you, and also specifically recognize the role of the NISC member agencies, as well as all of their personnel who are involved in our task teams. They're the ones sort of doing the hard substantive work and which we're putting together. So the work of NISC is really built on those individuals. And Brett, with that, I'm done. Happy to take questions. I don't know if there's any in the chat or if you're going to facilitate that.
Yeah, well, yeah, any questions? There is a question by Diane. Are you recommending any invasive plant or animals be restricted from entering the US? And I think this was in regards to slides from kind of in the beginning.
Okay, so the 2 agencies that are, I think, sort of the point in terms of having the regulatory authority. NISC doesn't have sort of the regulatory authority itself in terms of dealing with restrictions on imports. However, the Fish and Wildlife Service through the Lacey Act can regulate injurious wildlife. That the Lacey Act is over 100 years old, and so the term uses injurious wildlife, but it's seen as being synonymous with invasive species. And then also USDA, which can regulate plant imports, or as well as threats related to animal diseases, and that's mostly on the livestock side of things. One of the things that's happening, and some of the folks on this call, I don't know if sort of Wes is around, but there have been efforts with regards to the forecasting and horizon scanning to identify which species might be of concern within the trade. And so those can sort of be used to inform, for example, the Fish and Wildlife Service's listings under the Lacey Act. And Wes, I don't know if you want to talk to that in a little bit more detail.
Sure, thank you, Stas. Yeah, so just recently, a Fish and Wildlife Service and USGS joint venture, we reviewed nearly 1,000 vertebrates that are in the trade, fishes, mammals, reptiles, amphibians, and birds. And the results of that horizon scan looking at these exotic species that we're importing are being shared with Fish and Wildlife Service for review as part of their ecological risk screening summaries. And that would be the next step potentially towards an injurious listing of some of those high-risk species.
And that's just one example I mentioned. So we build on the work that the agencies are doing. And so that's a perfect example.
Any other questions? Happy to take them in chat, or actually Michaela has a question. Very informative presentation. Thank you. You mentioned looking into the creation of available funds for EDRR. Would NISC be also including recommendations on how these funds are requested, considered, and then acquired? For example, would those funds be something that could be requested in advance based off of historical and therefore likely future needs, or would they only be accessible after an EDRR scenario has been identified?
Right, good questions. And those are some of the questions that came up as we went through the development of our rapid response fund paper. In there, one of the things we looked at are, what are the possible sources? Would it be sort of congressional appropriations? Would there, in the past, there have been, in other sectors, there have been sort of taxes on industry or the like, in terms of how such a fund could be established. But basically, we're sort of leaving it up to, I'll say opportunity. We're just waiting to see if sort of the stars aligned in terms of how that funding could be provided. And the vehicle that I mentioned in terms of the pilot is through a request within the president's budget. In terms of, I think what you're getting in kind of the, for example, and the second part of that is the allocation of those funds. I presume that it would be accessible only after an introduction has occurred, and basically, some entity is saying, okay, we have evidence that this species might be introduced into this area. We need funds for verification, for the response, whatever it might be. And so I think it would probably be after an introduction. And the key question there, and this is more of kind of logistics in terms of how funds are moved within the federal government and to non-federal agencies, is making sure that those funds can be released quick enough so that they are usable. I know in some other systems, sometimes there's a reimbursement type of mechanism, but that doesn't always work depending on who the lead entity might be.
In Stas, Michaela had a follow-up, just how quickly, once that information is in, how quickly would those funds be accessible? Which I think you're kind of addressing there, but is there a typical turnaround time?
Right, and we don't, we just sort of recognize that was sort of a critical need. I think, the exercise that the Aquatic Nuisance Species Task Force is going through, and I think it's within the context of maybe Fish and Wildlife Service, is what are the funding mechanisms that they have in agreements with states or other entities, and how quickly can that be turned around? A lot of the examples that we looked at, a state might have a fund, but you could only apply to it once a year on a scheduled basis, which really doesn't work for EDRR. So we've recognized that in other funding mechanisms, there have been limitations in terms of getting dollars to the ground promptly when they're needed. And we've also highlighted examples from the disaster community in terms of, okay, for a wildland fire, for a hurricane, Department of Homeland Security has these mechanisms in terms of allocation of funds. And sometimes that involves sort of accreditation of entities up front in terms of being eligible to receive funds. So there's a number of mechanisms that can be used to, I think, expedite the transfer of those funds, but it's really going to depend on, which agency holds the money and then the mechanisms that it has for getting money out to a range of non-federal entities, if that's helpful. So I think those details still need to be worked out.
Any additional questions? You could either ask them or put them in the chat.
I'll just make sort of one other comment with regards to funds. One of the other considerations is sometimes when funding is provided to federal agencies, it has a kind of a specific time limitation, like you need to spend it in a particular fiscal year. And so versus being able to just sort of hold on to it and spend it at whatever point it might be necessary to use it. So one of the thoughts, if there were time limits or restrictions in terms of the spending of money and those funds hadn't been spent by that time, would be, could they be allocated to other purpose? For example, increasing capacity for monitoring or rapid response. So there may be other ways that funding could be spent if it looked like it was in danger of expiring.
Any additional questions? Okay. Well, Stas, thank you so much for taking the time to join the webinar and talk about NISC. It's really informative, and I appreciate your time. Just a reminder that our next webinar will be in November, third Thursday of the month. Thank you so much, Stas.
Great, thank you.
Thank you, everyone.